What's your biggest weakness?
I care too much.
I work too hard.
I'm a perfectionist.
Well, that's something we'll have to deal with.
All this and a good deal more after the break. Welcome back, all you talented humans. Today we're talking overcoming perfectionism. As always, I'm Nick. That's Eric. We're the Get Good Guys.
And this is the Get Good Guide. Well, hello.
I couldn't get over. I really wanted to do. What's your bigness? I really wanted to. But then I was like, I'm just going to sound stupid because nobody's going to know.
Nobody's going to. That's in the outtakes.
It's going to just sound like me being dumb.
I hope that you listen to the Patreon outtakes first. What is your bigness? Oh my goodness, we're overcoming perfectionism today, Nick.
We're going to do our best to work on that. It is not an easy thing to do.
No, sir.
It is not.
No, sir. No, it is not. And obviously this relates to the guide pretty closely, but we're not going to be sticking too close to any particular unit. There are several that will help you past this, but not a lot that sort of take it on directly. So we figured we'd try that in an episode.
Yeah, and we do that in the guide quite often, kind of an indirect approach on purpose.
Sneak up on it.
Yeah. But it's interesting to think about and talk about head on. Perfectionism, I think, is an interesting concept because it has both positive and negative connotations for everyone.
Sure.
And we're obviously looking at the more negative possibilities of that or consequences. We started with our little business interview intro here about what's your biggest weakness, and these kind of comical answers of I care too much, I work too hard, those kind of things that sound good.
I'm too detail oriented.
Yeah, I'm too much of a team player.
People are always telling me enough. It's time to think about yourself.
Yeah, please stop doing everything for everyone else.
Yeah. No, but it is interesting, right? I mean, as someone, we've both done this where we've had to either sit on interview boards or we've been interviewing people, and you get that. Well, I'm a bit of a perfectionist, and for me, I'm like, oh, that's a deal breaker, right? Like you're done here.
Yeah.
Good day. Primarily because our profession is one of not perfection, right? Constantly being faced with the inability to reach perfection.
Well, and if I was, and I'm not sure if this is the case, but if I was sitting on maybe a board of interviewers that needed some sort of perfection from the job, I feel like this is a not truthful or not thought out answer.
Right.
And doesn't really tell me any information.
Right. Absolutely. Well, so let's jump into it here. The big pitfalls of perfectionism or seeking a perfect outcome.
Sure.
Right. First and foremost, number one, with a bullet, right, is the failure to begin.
Yeah.
And how many times have we said this in the course of the podcast or in the guide? If you don't start, there will be no product. There will be no end.
It's impossible. It will not happen.
Right.
And this is something that very often we'll talk more about these kind of stories we tell ourselves a lot in this session today. But this is one where people feel like it's much safer. Essentially, right. I'm not putting myself at risk, and that's okay because now I'm not at risk.
I think oftentimes people who think of themselves as perfectionists, they're telling themselves a story.
Yeah,
and they're telling themselves kind of one of a family of stories, right? You've got the idea of like, oh well, as long as I don't completely commit. As long as I don't put myself completely out there, I can't. Anytime it's imperfect, which is every time, it's not my fault, or I can't be blamed.
I can be I can separate myself from it,
right?
Which is something I think we'll talk about doing maybe in a little bit of a positive way, but happens self-preservation mechanism. I think
definitely. There is, I think the term in psychology is the fear of failure, which everyone is afraid of failure.
How's that?
But specifically, this idea of I'm afraid of imperfection because of what it means, right? It means that I am imperfect.
Sure.
And as long as I stay on the sidelines, I can never be, criticized. I can never be imperfect. I can only sort of. I'm thinking of was the movie Napoleon Dynamite, where he's like, "Oh man, if Coach had just put me in, I could have
throw a pigskin over those mountains.
I could have won the big game. Or whatever.
Could have taken state. Things would have been different.
Yeah,
Yeah, right. And that's very common, whether it's athletic driven or not, I think a very common thing that everyone has some experience with,
Yeah.
of giving ourselves an out, essentially.
Yeah. And this is, what we're suggesting is not necessarily uncommon to think about. I think there's plenty of people, especially in the motivationally kind of realm, who will talk often about this. Continuous improvement is one of the strategies to try to overcome perfectionism, where we just sort of say like, well, you're always going to be able to get better. So just keep iterating, just keep, swinging the axe and get better and better. There's a quote, and I don't remember the originator, but it was a software engineer.
Okay.
He said, if you're not profoundly embarrassed by the first product that you put out, you released too late.
Interesting.
And that's really intriguing, because I think in the software development world, especially where novelty and iteration is so fast, and the development and the changes come so quickly, so much so that, when I was in high school, we used to talk about how I'm going to go get my computer science degree. But like now a 4-year degree is obsolete by the time you graduate.
Right.
And so, a lot the so-called full stack guys and gals are much more likely to be doing 6-week boot camps, trying to get better and better and better.
Yeah, it's not a communications degree, right?
Right.
It was like similar to that realm when we were in school. Well, while we're on quotes, I'll say one more that's very similar that I always think of in this moment, by Miyamoto Musashi, which is like old school samurai dude, or at least like figurehead essentially. But he has one where he says something about think like deeply of the world, but lightly of yourself. Essentially giving yourself the freedom to laugh at yourself, or realize that you're not the most, like, nobody really cares. Nobody really cares what you're doing. They care what they're doing, and that's helpful to remind yourself sometimes of like, well, this person doesn't really think about me like I think about me,
right?
And that can free you up a little bit, a little mental space for kind of letting it go.
Yeah, I think in the interest of dueling quotes, I believe it's Eleanor Roosevelt who said, you'll stop caring what other people think of you when you realize how infrequently they do.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
It's the same idea of like, look, man, I promise you not that many people are watching. Yeah. Just go and do it.
Yeah.
And there are plenty of organizations that have marketed to this. I'm thinking of Planet Fitness.
Sure.
Who sort of, they have a different business model, which we'll talk about some other time. But their marketing campaign was, hey, gyms are intimidating.
Right.
Come here where no one cares that you don't know what to do.
Yeah. We don't care. Yeah. It's obviously been successful for them.
Yeah, certainly for the organization. And I think there's a lot of success stories of people who are like, hey man, I just went out and started moving my body around and I felt better.
Well, and especially since to be healthier, you don't need to be measuring out meals. You don't need to go gym 5 times a week with a super planned schedule. Doing something is better than doing nothing.
Yeah, I mean, ask Austin. Right? Our inaugural Get Good guest who used the Get Good guide just to sort of like, hey, I just want to be a little healthier.
Yeah.
And it turned out, pretty
and
profound.
they're essentially giving you this freedom to think of yourself a little lighter. Right. Of it's okay. Everybody here is kind of in a similar boat, and which is what we talk about often with our Get Good groups, where it's nice and helpful to find people in a similar realm or similar skill level or mindset, because you feel a little more opening up to those people or letting them see your failures, as opposed to showing, I don't know, this coffee table I made to the best woodworker in the world is like, well, that's intimidating. Yeah,
of course. And there's an insecurity factor there, right? I think so many people dealing with, or they might refer themselves as a perfectionist rather than saying, I'm profoundly insecure.
Sure.
Well, I'm a perfectionist. Yeah, okay. Or you're a coward, right? Who's unwilling to put yourself forward, knowing that what you've produced isn't perfect, and frankly, probably isn't even in the top 1%.
Right.
What if your goal were different, right? What if your goal were just to be good? And that's a much more reachable, thing. We were talking about the letter grade. So many people are more willing to get an F than a C
sure.
by not turning in an assignment, right? Because they're like, well, I didn't do it. That's why I failed.
Which sounds insane.
It sounds crazy.
When you hear it right away, you're like, well, there's no way.
Right.
But then you think about it for a minute and you say to yourself, well, hang on a second. There's something to this.
Yep.
A C is tricky because you know that you've had to put some work in.
Yeah.
And you haven't received what you might consider as a good grade. Now, it depends on, person and what you're doing. But if you don't put any effort into that, if you just don't do the work, don't hand anything in, and you get a fail, well, of course, I didn't do it. Obviously, that's no big deal. I didn't do any work.
Right.
I was too busy. I was doing this instead.
Yeah, I had other priorities, whatever story you want to tell yourself. So when we think about overcoming perfectionism, there are these very specific strategies, and they tend to be phrased in the negative because so much of overcoming perfectionism is acknowledging that it's not something you should be doing.
Sure.
Perfectionism is not good.
Yeah.
Right? You should be avoiding it. You should be taking it, head on and saying, okay, if I don't start, I will never produce anything. So I have to begin. I have to get my brain around the fact that I will probably need multiple revisions.
Yeah, that it's going to be not great at first, and that's okay.
Yeah.
And that's okay. And it's actually better than okay. It's great because it means you're in a realm that's challenging you a little bit.
Yeah.
Right? If you're producing something that's already wonderful, well, that's fine. That's bad, but you're not at all in that realm of frustration in the learning curve, which means you're not going to be growing. You're just repeating what you already know.
All right, my friend. Well, I think we are nearing the end of our time. We've got a few more examples and I'm sure few more dueling quotes for the Patreon. So go ahead and check that out. But we will see all of you in the outro. Well, gee, thanks, everybody. Sure do appreciate you taking the time here when we're discussing overcoming perfectionism. As always, we have our companion episode over at the Patreon, patreon.com/getgoodguide. And you can check out a transcript of this very episode over at the center of the Get Good Galaxy, getgood.guide, where you can download your own copy of the Get Good Guide and start getting good. Maybe throw out the idea that it has to be perfect and just go ahead and begin. As always, I'm Eric. That's Nick. We're the Get Good Guys.
And this is the Get Good Guide. Your singing skills don't need to be great to be a recording artist because mine are non-existent. And I sound not terrible.
I sound phenomenal.
Through this, and this is just us. If I have somebody mixing all this crap.
Yeah, if we had a pro.
Yeah.